Welcome back. In case you didn't know, no-deal Brexit is slated to occur at the end of this month, October 2019. So in this video, I want to explain what is Brexit. It stands for British Exit from the European Union, and I'm going to talk about the no-deal Brexit that, again, is going to happen at the end of this month if nothing changes, which we only have a few weeks, so it really doesn't seem like things will change. If you are an American like me, maybe you think Brexit is too difficult to understand, you'll have to go into depth too much, and you don't have time for it. So this video is for you. It'll be a very brief explanation of Brexit and what it can mean for the UK. If you appreciate getting information like this, staying up to date with facts and sources, make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and hopefully you'll be notified. Maybe you won't because YouTube kind of decides what it wants to do on its own. Anyway, let's jump right in. So as I already said, Brexit just stands for British Exit from the European Union. The European Union consists of 28 countries throughout all of Europe, and they have one large governing body called the European Union, or I'll call it the EU for this video. In 2016, there was a referendum in the UK deciding if they wanted to stay in the European Union or to leave it. And they decided they wanted to leave. So this was the Brexit vote in 2016. And 52% of them decided to leave. You may hear that this is the largest vote in UK history, and that is technically correct. What it means is that more people voted in favor of Brexit than have voted for any one policy in the history of the UK. So that's a fairly significant piece of information. One thing you may not be aware of, as I wasn't, is this is not the first time a Brexit referendum was talked about. You see, in the 70s, just 3 years after the UK even joined the EU, they had a vote to decide if they should stay or leave. At that point, they decided to stay, obviously because they're still a part of it, but that just goes to show that Brexit is not just a 2016 very recent thing. It has been, at least in the mind of some, for decades. Since that 2016 vote, there have been 3 prime ministers of the UK. Essentially, that means that 2 of them have basically lost their jobs because of Brexit. Either they were unable to bring it about or they just disagreed with it in general. So currently, there is Boris Johnson as the prime minister. And he has a deadline, like I said, of October 31st to enact some form of deal. If the UK cannot come up with a deal with the EU by that time, they will do what's called a no-deal Brexit. So what is the point of Brexit and why was it voted for? Well, the reason you'll most often hear is immigration. You see, one of the main, positives or negatives, depends on how you look at it, of the EU is that it basically allows anyone else in the EU to travel to other EU countries fairly easily and be able to live there indefinitely. So what that means is that anyone in any EU country can decide to move to the UK and live there, which the UK, being one of the more advanced members of the EU, has seen a fairly large influx of immigrants. Significantly more people have come than have left the UK. So that is one reason that Brexit was actually voted for. Now, I really hate when this point is brought up and people say that if you voted for Brexit or if you supported Brexit, you're a racist. And that's not the case whatsoever. And that's a ridiculous statement. If you oppose unlimited, unchecked immigration, that does not make you a racist. It means you want to be able to control better who is coming across your border. And that's what is happening here. That is one of the largest reasons, perhaps, Brexit was in fact passed. Now, speaking of immigration, this does bring up one of the main problems with Brexit, and that is the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So both areas are part of the EU. Northern Ireland, however, is part of the UK. So what that means is that if the UK leaves the European Union, the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland will now have to be a real enforced border. It would basically be as if 2 states suddenly became part of different countries. You have to enforce a border with customs and trade and all sorts of things. So here you can see one of the main arguments against Brexit is that they don't know what to do about that border. And it's still being talked about. Another part of being with the EU means that you are basically part of their trade agreements. So the EU collectively will decide on trade agreements between members of the EU and third-party countries, and then you'll be a part of that, and so you'll benefit from those trade agreements. So looking at that, it looks like a good thing. But if you disagree with those trade proposals, you're kind of out of luck. Because being part of the EU, you cannot form your own trade agreements with other members of the EU or, again, third-party countries. So that means that you are basically locked in to whatever this larger government decides for you to trade. You don't have your own trade agreements. That can either be a good thing if you have very little power to negotiate trade, but if you're a country like the UK, which presumably has a fair amount of leveraging power, that's not necessarily in your best interest. Another fairly large negative is the membership fee. You don't belong to the EU just for free. As a matter of fact, in 2016, after taking out how much they paid and how much they received, the UK overall paid £8.5 billion, the equivalent of $10.8 billion in 1 year. And so it makes sense why some would use this as an argument to leave, because that's a lot of money. Now, all these things put together, the main problem with those who want to leave, so the exiters versus the remainders, is that the exiters recognize that it's a problem with sovereignty. You see, being a part of the EU basically means you lose some of your sovereignty. As a matter of fact, I'll just read here. It says, for Brexiters, sovereignty was seen as a simple win. Even the most ardent remainers had to admit that EU membership involved giving up some control over domestic affairs. So being a part of the EU does in fact mean, we've already seen, that some of the issues that you yourself would deal with as a country are in fact kicked to this much larger governing body. And that is problematic to many individuals who want to retain their own sovereignty and retain the importance of being a country itself. To kind of sum this up, Labour MP said that the EU was, quote, an attempt to replace the democratic power of the people with a permanent administration. Which he's essentially saying is you're replacing the elected officials in the UK with EU administrators who are not elected officials. So now let's look at how many times the UK and the EU have been in disagreement. So here we have two graphs. The charts show you what percentage of votes that specific country disagreed with the EU in that time frame. So in the first one on the left, 2004 to 2009, we see that United Kingdom disagreed with the EU proposals something like 3% of the time. It's not a huge number. But from 2009 to 2015, the UK disagreed with what the EU decided to do 12% of the time. So overall, they still agreed most of the time, but you can see that the UK dramatically disagrees more than most of the other countries do. And so if anyone would consider leaving the EU, it makes sense it would be the UK. Now, some of the problems with the no-deal Brexit include immigration. For example, there are a fair amount of immigrants who live in the UK from other EU countries. If you are no longer part of the EU, would they have to then be sent back to their respective countries? And what about those who are UK citizens living abroad? Would they also all have to go back to the UK? These are things that were hopefully going to be brought out with a deal, but as of yet, there has not been any agreement. There's also the problem with trade, as in the UK would have to form its own trade agreements with countries that are currently in the EU, and the EU as a large administration may not approve of that because they wouldn't like them leaving the EU and then making their own deals. There are a bunch of issues with no-deal Brexit. Now, I'm not trying to inject my own bias here, but I am saying that there are some very real problems with no-deal Brexit. And in large part, we won't really know what those problems are until they occur. Now, one of the possible solutions that has been talked about as far as the UK leaving would be something like the Norway model. You see, Norway is technically not a member of the EU. They do not belong to the EU at all. They still do pay dues, and by paying dues, they are then allowed to be part of the trade negotiations and a few other parts of the EU. So one of the benefits here is you pay a little bit less dues. It's not a ton less, but it is a little bit less. One of the big negatives, though, is Norway has no say whatsoever in what the EU decides to do. So earlier we saw the UK disagreed with the EU about 12% of the time. If the UK enacted this Norway model, they would have no say whatsoever in what the EU does ever. And that is a fairly large problem in my eyes. You are essentially beholden to this administration you have no influence on whatsoever. So I do not see that as being a very reasonable outcome. These are some of the outcomes of Brexit. I didn't go into a ton of detail on all these things, but the basic ideas still hold. There are going to be problems with immigration, with trade, with sovereignty if Britain does decide to leave in a no-deal Brexit. But if they do not decide to leave, there are still going to be problems because, as we saw in 2016 at least, the majority of the population wanted to leave. So they are kind of between a rock and a hard place. They've tried to come up with deals. Either the EU doesn't agree with it or the people themselves don't agree with it. So it's a very difficult situation here. So I guess in a few weeks we will see if Boris Johnson managed to get some miracle deal out of nowhere or if he will stick with his date for the no-deal Brexit. So in case you're interested, while I am American, my mom is actually from England. And so half of me is British, and that half of me cared enough to make this video. The other half, just gonna kind of see what happens. But the British half of me really wants to know what's going on here, so I decided to look it up and explain it to you in case you were interested. If you made it this far, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like to help YouTube know that you appreciate this content, and ask any questions or comments you have down below. I've also included a fair amount of articles about Brexit if you have more questions in the description. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.